All right, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar today. Is this grant right for your organization? And this is a step-by-step guide to using the Go, No-Go tool. I'm thrilled to have you here. My name is Allison Jones, and I'm the founder of Spark the Fire Writing. So I'm going to walk you through this tool that I recently developed for my team. It's one of my favorite tools for grant decision making. And I love it so much that I wanted to share it with you. So this webinar is designed to provide you with actionable strategies and insights to help you make confident, informed decisions about which grants to pursue. So whether you're a seasoned grant writer or just starting out, the guide offers a practical framework to simplify the decision-making process and align your efforts with the organization's priorities. So my goal today is to show you how to use this guide to make strategic, confident decisions about which grant opportunities to pursue. And this tool, you can use it to align to your funding opportunities with your organization's mission, capacity, and your priorities. So if you have any questions during the session, feel free to type them into the chat. And my colleague Pete is monitoring the chat, and I'm going to answer questions at the end of the session during the Q&A. And you can also share any quick thoughts or comments in the chat throughout the webinar. I'd love to hear what you're thinking as you go. So a little about me. My name is Allison. There are two things about my company that are, I think, really unique. And one is that my certificate in grant writing class is assessment-based, and each student actually writes a complete grant proposal and receives individualized feedback on their writing as your proposal goes through 8 different drafts. And the second thing that's unique about my company is that I realized there was a gap between folks getting their certificate in grant writing and then needing 3 years of experience or 2 years of experience to actually get a job as a grant writer. And so I started a grant writing firm that allows my students to practice. It's a paid internship where they actually work on actual proposals and build their writing portfolio. So I offer grant writing classes, grant review, consultation, and internships. I'm a GPA approved trainer, an adjunct professor at several colleges, and I have 25 years of experience in fundraising. I also have an MED in adult education, and so my goal is always to teach in a way that will help you remember what we talked about and implement action steps right away. So because I'm a professor, I always have to do the learning objectives. So here they are. First, understand the purpose of the Go, No-Go guide and how it can help you navigate the complex world of grant decision-making with clarity and confidence. Second, learn how to evaluate grant opportunities effectively using a structured, objective process. And this is going to empower you to focus on opportunities that really do align with your organization's mission and capacity. And third, you'll gain strategies for collaboration and practical implementation so that your team is engaged, you've got the right people at the table to help make decisions. And with these objectives in mind, let's jump in. So imagine this, and I'd love to hear in the chat if this has ever happened to you. A small nonprofit organization receives notice about a grant opportunity, and it's a really large amount, more funding than they've ever considered, and the team is immediately excited. However, the grant focuses on expanding services for seniors, while the organization primarily serves young families. Despite this misalignment, the funding amount is really hard to ignore. And so the team convinces themselves that they can adapt their program to fit with the grant requirements. And with the deadline just weeks away, they scramble to pull a proposal together. Does this sound familiar? Has anyone experienced this before? I know I have. So typically what happens, the executive director takes on extra writing duties, staff are pulled from their regular work to gather data, and a last minute consultant could be hired to help edit or write the submission. And by the time it's submitted, everyone is exhausted. key projects are delayed, everyone's morale is really low, and other important relationships with grant makers have been neglected. And typically, a rejection email is going to arrive, and it's going to be disappointing. So worse, the feedback from that uh, email usually will highlight the lack of alignment with the funder's priorities. And so the key takeaway is that without a process for evaluating opportunities, organizations can risk chasing misaligned funding and overextending staff. And these are real challenges. Wasting resources. If you've ever worked on a federal grant application can demand 80 to 200 hours of work. And so this is not something that you want to pursue unless you're really sure that the alignment is there. Have you ever heard of foundations who won't accept applications? A lot of times we find them and we think, oh my gosh, this is the perfect fit for our organization, but then they don't accept applications. And the reason a lot of foundations turn to this invitation-only model is actually because they receive so many grant applications that are misaligned, and it just really wastes their resources trying to review them all. And so I guess that's just another reason why it's a good idea not to apply if there's not a really great alignment, because we don't want more foundations turning into invite only. And there can be some serious risks. For example, let's say you actually write and submit the application and it's awarded. If you accept the award and then you can't comply with the award terms, maybe you proposed something that was more rigorous than you could actually accomplish, or you didn't actually plan through how much money the grant was going to need. The federal government and other grant makers as well can enforce actions like you're not allowed to apply for any more awards until your organization basically complies or reconciles what the situation was. So you definitely want to avoid that. So what is this guide? Hopefully you received it in the email. It's got 14 assessment questions and a weighted scoring system and collaborative team decision-making. So this is meant to get a whole team together to sit down and look at a grant opportunity and compare the alignment of the funding with your organization's capacity. It starts with just basic information gathering. So what is the funder and the opportunity name? What is the request amount range, and what is the deadline? And then that's followed by instructions, which include that there are 2 weighted questions that you'll want to make sure are definitely in alignment. I mean, if the first 2 questions, and we'll go through those, are not in alignment with your organization, it's pretty clear that you might want to take a step back and not go through with that one. So the scoring system is weighted. Each question you assign a score of 0 to 4. And so the higher score indicates a stronger alignment or readiness. And then at the end of the evaluation form, the guide, you simply tally the score and you determine which threshold your opportunity falls into. So go, which is 40 to 56 points, means that the opportunity is strongly aligned with your organization, and it's a grant that you should prioritize. Neutral is 28 to 39 points. And for neutral scorings, it really means that you should take a closer look. There might be challenges or risks, but they could be addressed. So it doesn't mean that you shouldn't move forward. It just means you're going to really need to think through how you're going to plan, how you're going to garner additional resources. So in other words, just proceed cautiously and make sure that you're prepared to address any weak areas. And then no-go is 0 to 27 points. And grants in this range have a significant misalignment or barriers that make them a poor fit. And it's an indication that your time would be spent better pursuing an opportunity that's more aligned with your organization. I mentioned team collaboration, so make sure that you have the right people from different areas of your organization. For example, you want to make sure you have program staff there that can actually speak to the feasibility of the proposed activities. You'd want to have someone from finance there that can weigh in on the budgets and the matching requirements, if there are matching requirements. And then, of course, your leadership, someone from leadership that can make sure that the opportunity is in alignment with your strategic plan or your strategic priorities if you don't have a formalized strategic plan. Next, you're going to want to assign roles. So I suggest, and here's how we do it on our team, is that we designate one person that's just going to gather all the information about the funder and sort of present that. And then someone else is going to actually score the specific questions, and then another person facilitates the discussion. And so this kind of shared approach prevents the burden from falling on just one person, and it creates a more balanced, well-rounded evaluation process. A lot of times I review grants for foundations and government entities, and that's very similar to, this process is very similar to how a grant maker is going to review your application. There's usually three of us, 3 or 4 individuals that read the same 100 applications, and we score them individually, but then we come together and we form consensus on what the final score is. And then it's really transparent the way that the funding is made, because they just start with the application that received the most points and award them the money, and then it just goes down until there's no money left. So it's really just as simple as that. And interestingly, the difference between actually getting a grant award and not getting a grant award can be a matter of a single point. A lot of times you'll see several organizations score the exact same point, and that's when you see partial funding made because there was only a limited amount in the pool left. So next, you do want to make sure to schedule time for the discussion, go through the guide together and use the scoring system. And then finally, I do encourage you to document your decisions. I don't know about you, but I've often been in situations where we sort of looked at a foundation and then a couple years go by and we go, whoa, what about that one foundation? And so if you have already documented it, you can go back and review your notes and see why it was determined that it wasn't a great fit. And then you can review the guidelines of the grant maker and see if anything has changed that might make it more in alignment now than it was at that time. Just to make sure everyone's on the same page, I consider there to be 5 different types of grant makers. So government entities, foundations, corporations, tribes, and then clubs and associations, which is like your Rotary Club, for example, Kiwanis, Zonta. And so as you're researching these opportunities, you want to carefully review all the information available so that you have a strong sense of what is this funder looking for. So I encourage you to look at their website if they have one, read through their instructions and their guidelines. I always read through the application form itself, like let's take a look at the exact questions that are being asked. And when I do that, I'm often looking for questions that could be like, if it's an application to a bank, there might be a question that says, do you bank with us? Do you have an account with us? Or do you have any volunteers that are employed with our bank? And so when you see questions like that, that can be a good sense that that might be a limitation. And I've actually heard of, not to go off on a tangent, but I've actually heard of organizations that get a bank account at multiple banks just so that they can say, yes, I have an account whenever they're applying to bank applications or RFPs. So a RFP is a request for proposal, and a NOFA is a notification of funding availability. And you'll want to just read through those carefully with a highlighter, especially if it's a federal grant or even a county or state grant, municipality. Go through with a highlighter, read through it several times, and just make sure that you've looked at every single detail. And then there's some grant makers that don't have a website. And so for that, I do recommend using a grant research database. And I'm going to talk about those in just a minute. Also look out for scoring rubrics. A lot of times the organization actually will tell you what areas they're rating your application, especially government applications. And so you want to take a close look at what is scored, what is weighted most heavily, and then compare that to your capacity. So in terms of just researching grants, I always like to show this startling statistic. 90% of foundations do not have a website, right? That's so shocking. And so what that means is that if you're only looking at websites for opportunities, you're missing out on what's there. And so you want to make sure that you do access one of these grant research databases. So where to find grant makers, in addition to web searches. For clubs and associations, you can look at your local newspaper. I always look for listings of what clubs are meeting. You can look at the yellow pages for different associations, the yellow pages online. And then these are some of the grant databases that I recommend: GrantStation, Instrumental, and Foundation Directory Online. And on my next slide, I have a comparison chart. So we'll talk about the comparison of those databases in just a minute. But in a lot of states, tribes provide grants. So you'll want to look at tribal maps and see what tribes are historically located near where your organization has its service area. For corporations, you want to look at the business newspaper. I often look for articles that are like the top 50 businesses to work for, or the top 50 just ratings of businesses. And then I like to go through those businesses and see which ones have a local presence and might be a match for our organization. Foundations, of course, you've got these databases as well as the website. And then for government, you want to look at grants.gov for federal grant opportunities. For state and county and municipality, you actually go to the government website itself. You can search for RFP, which stands for Request for Proposal, or you can contact your legislators and ask them how they announce grant awards. They might have a listserv, or your individual legislator might have information on their website about grant opportunities that are available. So here is my comparison table of these grant databases. There's quite a few of them. These are the ones that are most reputable. So instrumental.com, Foundation Directory Online by Candid, GrantStation, Grant Watch, Grant Gopher, and grantadvisor.org. And grantadvisor.org actually isn't really a foundation database, but it's what I like to call an Angie's List for grant makers. So you actually can go to that website and anonymously rate different foundations and read reviews, which is quite cool. So it's absolutely free to use, and I encourage you to write reviews of the foundations that you've received grants from. So that really helps other people out. Like, how long did it take to hear back? Were they communicative? Was it transparent? Things like that. So in terms of price, you can see the pricing. Instrumental is $2.99 per month. Foundation Directory $2.19. GrantStation is $6.99 per year, but I actually have a discount code that you can get it for $95 a year, and I'll give you that discount code if you're interested. Grant Watch is $199 per year. Grant Gopher is $49 per month. And of course, Grant Advisor is free. What distinguishes the amount, the cost of the databases is how many hits they have in their database. So Instrumental, 410,000, Foundation Directory Online, 310, Grant Station, 40,000. Grant Watch says that they have 275. I'm not sure if that's accurate information. It might be opportunities, which would be a little bit different than the number of grant makers. I'm not as familiar with Grant Gopher. And then Grant Advisor currently has only 934, but that's just user initiated. So the more we actually write reviews, the more will be in here. So a mapping function is really critical. What that means is that you'll be able to look at a map of the United States and click into the state where you're located and see how many grants were made in that state. The Foundation Directory has the most robust mapping feature because not only can you see it from the state perspective, but it drills down all the way into the state, county, city, and legislative district. So for some states, like, for example, Washington State, there's a real difference between Eastern Washington and Western Washington, and typically funders will either fund in Eastern or Western, but not both. And so by clicking into this map, you can see, do they fund on the east side or do they fund on the west side, for example? Push notifications. So that means, do you have to go to the database or do they send you lists of grants and opportunities? So that's another thing to keep in mind. And then on this next page, whether or not they have grants management capabilities. And then here are the discount codes that I have. So for Instrumental, if you use this link or this code, Spark the Fire 50, you can get $50 off your first month. Candid doesn't have a discount, but if you go to this website, candid.org/find-us, you can find out which libraries have it available. They have a library agreement. So it's usually available at the regional library, the chair of the library system for your location. Grant Station, I do have a code. You can get it for $95 for the whole year using this discount code. And I'd be happy to send all of this out to you in the follow-up email as well. Grant Watch actually has a weekly subscription for $18, which I think is reasonable just to check it out. Grant Gopher doesn't have a free trial. And then of course, Grant Advisor is free. So I did want to note in terms of the percentage of grants in these databases that are government grants versus foundations. GrantStation has probably the most government grants listed in their website. But Foundation Directory and Instrumental also have government grants. They're definitely heavier weighted towards foundations. GrantStation also has a lot of corporations listed. I would say maybe more than Foundation Directory and Instrumental. So each one is different. And then I'm just not as familiar with these three. Grant Advisor won't have any government grants at all. It will only be foundations and corporate foundations. And maybe some tribes too, now that I think about it. Okay, so let's see. In terms of using these databases, a lot of times my strategy will be to actually subscribe to one for a month and do all of my research and then turn it off. That's a good way to save money instead of just keeping it running. But they are all different. For example, I could type the name of a foundation into Instrumental and there's a hit, and I could type that same name into Foundation Directory and it won't find it at all. So yeah, they're all just really different. So it does help to, I think, look at these different ones. All right, so moving forward and kind of getting back to this guide, I wanted to consider how the guide fits into your overall grant seeking process. So here's the timeline. Identify potential funding opportunities, use the go, no guide to evaluate the fit. And then if it's a go, assign roles and begin preparation. If it's neutral, then you want to think about how are we going to address weak areas before we move forward. And if it's a no-go, then make sure to document the reasons for not pursuing it and then move on. So here's just a little case study. This actually happened with my team recently, and so I thought I'd share with you how this worked. So we were utilizing the go, no go guide with a nonprofit, and the nonprofit was dedicated to promoting music education and live performances. And we were considering applying for a grant from this really large foundation. Their minimum grant award is $100,000. And the nonprofit organization had not ever received a grant of that amount. The foundation supports well-established nonprofit organizations across the US, including in areas of culture, education, health, and social services. They predominantly fund program capital and on a limited basis, endowment support. And so the deadline was close approaching. There was an alignment between the mission because this was a nonprofit arts organization and one of their areas was culture, and it was a fit in terms of the mission alignment. The problem was that there was this imminent deadline. The deadline was closing in and there was really limited time to prepare a comprehensive application. And really, as we thought about the opportunity, we kept sort of going back and forth on, well, what project should we pitch? And so because the large foundation didn't fund general operating, they only funded program support, the pitch really needed to be a specific project. And so, we used the guide, we thought about how much time we had, we thought about our resources and the possibility of getting this amazing grant. And what we decided was to wait until the following year to apply. That way we could really take the time to create a project that was going to be super strong instead of sort of rushing and maybe presenting some things in our grant application that we hadn't fully thought through, or that we hadn't considered all the project budget pieces. So you always want to make sure you have a strategic fit. Make sure that your organization has capacity not only to prepare the application, but to also actually run the program. And just make sure that you have sufficient time to develop a really strong application. So I'm just going to go through the questions real quick. The first one is about mission and vision. So does the funder's mission align with your organization's mission and vision? The second one is strategic plan alignment. Whether or not your organization has a strategic plan, like a formal strategic plan, consider whether this opportunity is going the direction that you're already planning to go. As opposed to taking you into a different direction where you're starting a new project or program that could distract your organization from its core programs and services. You want to consider the funding history of the grant maker. So what have they funded organizations like yours, at what levels? And to make that assessment, if it's a foundation, I'll typically look at the 990 tax return, where you can find a list of the grants a foundation has given out. They list the name of the organization that received it, what the project was that was funded, and the amount that was received. And so going through that, you can kind of look and see, do you notice any names of organizations that are similar than yours? And that can help you determine if it's going to be a good fit. Consider the return on investment. So have you ever applied for a grant that was like 10 pages long and the grant award amount was only $2,000? that's kind of like I feel like that's a poor return on investment. That can take you a really long time to put that information together for maybe a potentially really small grant. So always just weigh the time it's going to take to complete the application with the potential award. I don't mind, applying for a 1,000 or a 2,000 or a $5,000 grant if it's only a couple pages long. But when it gets really lengthy, I might consider whether it's, a good use of our time. So community need, is the need well documented in the community, and is it supported by data? So for example, a lot of times you'll see federal grant opportunities that want to fund uh, um, low income populations in your geography. And as you look at your data and your geography, maybe you don't have as high poverty as other geographies in the United States. And so you really have to consider and it's sort of weird to think about, like, you don't want your community to have a lot of low income families living there, but at the same time, that's where those fundings are usually going. And so just thinking about instead, um, is the community supported by the data? Is there a real need there compared to other places in the world that might be more competitive, especially for those federal grant applications? So your expertise and experience, do you currently have the expertise and experience required to execute the project successfully? Or are you going to have to bring on more individuals? Is it gonna require professional development, training, et cetera? So that's something to consider. And then your staffing capacity, do you already have the required staff, or will you need to hire additional staff? And is the funding of the grant opportunity enough to actually fully pay for those positions that you would need to bring in? You also want to think about partnerships. So with partnerships, do you have established partnerships or relationships that are going to be needed for the project? And think through also, especially with federal grant applications, that your partners, your subcontractors, have to be in compliance with the federal grant as well. And so that means that they have to be capable of doing the reporting so that you can create the reports that you need to turn in. And so you want to make sure that those partnerships are strong, and that those organizations that you partner with have the capacity as well to comply with the reporting and other requirements of the grant. So number 9 out of 14 in the grant questions is time. Do you have adequate time to develop a strong competitive proposal? Our team, in terms of developing a proposal, we have a 50-day plan that is from actually identifying and determining that the opportunity is a good fit, to actually writing it and going through the review process that includes the review by the client. And then we always submit the grant proposal, if we can, at least 2 weeks ahead of the deadline. What I've found over the years is that when you submit early, a lot of times the grant maker, and this doesn't include government grant makers so much, unless it's like a Seattle arts and culture or something where it's not a competitive application. But if it's a foundation, for sure, when you submit your application early, a lot of times they'll call you and they'll give you feedback on what you submitted and give you the opportunity to make adjustments. They're never going to do that if you're submitting on the deadline. And when I review grants, oftentimes we're actually asked to make notes to share with the applicants so that they can get feedback on how we reviewed their grant and what areas to improve. Required match. So is there a required match, cash or in kind? And do we have the resources to meet it? And then indirect costs. This is another consideration. Does the grant opportunity allow for indirect costs that's going to recover some of your indirect administrative overhead? Number 12 of 14, so does the grant opportunity distract or detract? Basically, is it going to pull you away from other projects that you're already working with or working on? Is it going to pull resources away from that? Number 13 is reporting and compliance. So make sure you find out what is involved in the reporting and that reporting burden is going to be reasonable for your organization's capacity. And number 14, the final one, is are there any restrictive conditions or limitations that make the grant less attractive? So those are the 14 questions that are assessed. And then, like I said, there's a scoring tally at the very last page of the grant assessment. And then you come up with a score, and that tells you if it's a go, if it's a neutral, or if it's a no-go. So I'd love to open it up for questions. I know we went through quite a lot of information. And so I'll go back and review the chat, but if you have any other questions, if you want to unmute yourself to ask, you're welcome to do that.
Hi, Allison. Thank you so much for having this webinar. I was really excited when you sent out the email because I've been looking for something similar to what you created to really assess funding opportunities. So I'm definitely thinking about integrating it into my workflow.
Awesome.
And I really appreciate how you kind of also touch base on how the assessment also aligned with prospecting, because as someone who does a lot of prospecting, one of the issues that I've been learning is that whereas I've been able to identify mission aligned funders, I need to get better at identifying funding opportunities, and there is no need to actually include any funding opportunities that the client won't be able to necessarily go for. So I'm really looking forward into utilizing this for the prospecting that I do for my clients. I'm curious to know, when you do use the assessment as part of your prospecting, does that lengthen the time required to prospect? Because I know with instrumental, a lot of us are very excited because they give like so many funding opportunities, but I've been using it recently. But when you actually take the time to sit down to really analyze, is this worth my client's time? Most of them are not. So I'm just curious to know, can you talk to us more about the time requirement of using this assessment as part of prospecting for clients or nonprofit organizations?
Yeah, great. So yeah, our team has been using this for about a couple of months now, and I've definitely noticed that that we're using it much more quickly now. So now that we're kind of comfortable with it, we're able to go through the guide in what maybe was a 30 or 45-minute meeting is now closer to a 15-minute meeting or even shorter. And so it just, the more you use it, I think the quicker it becomes. And we don't use it for every single grant opportunity. A lot of times we are looking at an opportunity and it's a clear match. It's obvious that this is a perfect match for our organization. We're not going to go through the whole guide for every single opportunity. It's really helpful for those trickier ones where there's just a lot of things to consider and weigh. And so that's how we really love to use it. And thank you for your question. Did I fully answer it?
Yes. So what I'm hearing is that you really use it to assess like individual funding opportunities, not part of your prospecting.
Right. So this is, if I'm looking at instrumental, I would be looking at the matches that maybe we haven't looked at yet, or we're still researching. I think it says researching. And so we'll use this tool for the researching. And then if it's if it scores like neutral or if it's a go, then we change that from researching to planned. And at that point, what our team does is we have somebody that starts to actually prepare the application. And so that involves, really going in and finding all of the questions and putting them into a document, a Google Doc, so that the whole team can see it. We list every question with the character allowance for each question and make sure that everything is detailed so that when the writer starts to work on the application, everything is there. So.
Okay, that's very useful. Thank you.
Yeah. So Jared, you had a question about the databases government. I think I answered that earlier. Marty asked about using more than one. I think I answered that one as well. Do you keep track of your searches within the platform or on a separate platform spreadsheet? So it depends on whether I'm keeping a subscription to Instrumental or one of those databases going. Right now I am. And so we're actually tracking everything on Instrumental with their grants management. I find it really simple. They have the little tasks. So we call it a 50-day preparation. And so there are tasks that are spaced out with deadlines. And then as soon as somebody completes that task, they check it off. And then it shows the next task that's due, which might be submitting the full, proposal or sending it to the client review, or it might be, getting our hands on the award letter so that we know when the report is due, and then we enter the report deadlines in and things like that. So that's been really helpful for us. Marty, you also said, I wish every funder would send back a review sheet, good or bad. Me too. Me too. Let's see, I think I caught any other questions?
Can I ask a question about your classes?
Of course, yeah.
I try to get on the info one bit while we're here. This has been great, so thank you very much for this really great info. What is the executive class? What's the difference between that and the others?
Yeah, so I originally designed that class because I had students that would take the certificate course, and their organization was basically paying for them to attend the class, but then they might want to work on a grant proposal for their church or something like that, and it made me feel a little uncomfortable. So the original idea was to set up 2 coaching sessions during the course so that the employer who was sending their team members could actually be a part of those coaching sessions and talk about how the grant is going. And it just added this sort of transparency. I've since expanded it though. And now it's just adding to consultation or coaching sessions. Everyone gets office hours. So you can just directly schedule office hours into my scheduler anytime. And that's a 15-minute meeting. But the coaching sessions are, maybe I want to talk about, or maybe you want to talk about your career trajectory, or just different things specific to your individual session. Sometimes I have people use it to talk about some issues that they're facing at work that they just need to bounce some ideas off of because there's a conflict going on that they need some guidance with. So it can be used in that way too.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else? All right. Well, I want you to know that if you think of questions, feel free to contact me. I'll have Pete put my email address in the chat. You can email me. Feel free to call me. I have discovery hours where you can just talk to me about things anytime you want. I don't want our relationship to end here. I'd like to continue to get to know you and be a resource for you as your career and your organization progresses. So thanks for being here today, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.